At its most basic level, a sourdough starter culture is just a mixture of flour and water. The flour contains wild yeasts and bacteria, and these remain inactive until the water hits them. Gradually, over time, the simple blend of flour and water becomes a complex and fascinating host to cooperating colonies of wild yeasts and lactobacillus bacteria from the flour and from the surrounding environment, as well as acids and enzymes, alcohol and carbon dioxide. To make a starter, you need only consider what kind of flour is best to start with and how to feed it. Ideally, you should start with an organic rye flour because this contains large populations of wild yeasts and bacteria and plenty of nutrients for them both. If you watch our film The Great Leaven Race, you'll see that rye was the winner in terms of activity because it rose the fastest. Things you don't need to add to your starter are any kind of fruit and vegetables. These have been used in the past for the yeast on their skins, but the yeast you really want are those in the flour. Plus, if you're adding fruit and veg, you're also adding unwanted moulds and possibly pesticides, neither of which will do you or your starter any good at all. To make a brand new starter, I'm going to put 40 grams of rye flour in this glass jar with 60 grams of water, and then stir it to remove any lumps. To get the dry flour off the bottom, and beat it to get any lumps out, because that makes it easier for the yeast and the bacteria to actually work and process the flour. I'm just going to finish cleaning the sides there. Now I'm just going to pull the elastic band down to the carefully, down to the level. But this helps us judge a very subtle rise. Later on it will become much more visible. Now I'm going to just put the lid on loosely, don't tighten it, and leave this at room temperature for about 12 hours, and then come back very excitedly to see what's going on. It's 24 hours since we first started this, and already you can see it's risen above the elastic band. You can see, I don't know if you can show, tiny bubbles there and rising. And if you look in the top, you can see it's beginning to slightly dome up, and you can see the odd bubble or two. This starter is now at a temperature of 28 degrees, and it's really important to keep it nice and warm so that it can be as active as possible. Before I feed it, I just want to show you the bubbles that are here. Look, by pushing that there, you can see bubbles inside. Absolutely lovely development in such a short time, only 24 hours. 40 grams of rye flour, 60 grams of water. At this stage you can see there's much less of a rise than there was in the beginning. That's because the flour is now exhausted. The starter is still alive, but it's not as lively and vigorous as we want it to be. So we're going to throw about half of it away and then feed the remainder to make it all lively and fresh again. People often get confused about why we throw half of it away at this stage. It's because we've still got bacteria and wild yeasts in the other half. But what's happened is that the wild yeast population has increased. It's been self-replicating madly, you remember, and it's exhausted all the food. So we're going to chuck out half and then bring in reinforcements. So this is what exhausted starter looks like. thin. Very thin actually. There are some bubbles, but it's not got the strength, the gluten strength or anything that you're looking for. So I'm feeding it with 40 grams of rye flour and 60 grams of water. Mix it up. So far we've been feeding our starter with pure rye flour, and that's because rye has lots of yeasts and bacteria naturally present, and that makes lots of nice bubbly activity. But bubbles alone are not enough. Once the carbon dioxide has lifted the mixture, you need something to stop it collapsing again, and that something is the muscle of gluten. Otherwise, as my grandma used to say, you get all sizzle and no sausage. So, what flour do we use to build strength and gluten into our starter? Rye flour is the weakest, wholemeal is next, and white bread flour is the strongest of all. This is the opposite to how they compare in terms of yeast and bacteria activity, where rye is the highest, wholemeal is the middle, and white is the lowest of all because most of the yeast and bacteria were sifted out when they were sifting out the bran. To obtain the ideal combination of strength and activity that we're now looking for, we use a blend of 10% rye and 90% white. The feeding ratio for this flour is 50-50, and this is how we're going to transform our rye starter gradually into a wheat starter. Before I feed it, I always like to sniff it to see how it's doing. And this smells very fresh and pleasant and tangy. There's a light smell of fermentation, and that's a good indicator that we're almost there. Now I can give it breakfast. 50 grams of blend and 50 grams of water. So how do you tell when your starter is finally ready to use? The first thing is the level of activity. How bubbly is it? How much has it risen since you last fed it? And what does the surface look like? The second thing is the smell. Now your judgment of this is obviously going to develop over time, but it's actually quite instinctive. If it smells good, it is. And if it smells bad, probably best to start again. Good starter, like this one, smells pleasantly fresh and tangy, like yesterday. Bad starter will probably smell like acetone or paint stripper, or even, as I've had students tell us, of old socks. If your starter smells anything like paint stripper or acetone, it's probably because you've forgotten to feed it, it's got exhausted, it's starving, and you started to produce acetaldehyde. Chuck it. If your starter smells anything like old socks, chuck it again. It's probably been invaded by some unwholesome bacteria and you don't want anything to do with it. Finally, there's the taste. In French baking schools, they have their students make notes on the variations in acidity several times a day. Basically, young starter, which is what we've got here, will taste fresh and slightly milky, faintly tangy. This is where the yeasts have dominance over the bacteria. Mature starter will have flavours in the spectrum of strong natural yoghurt. Old starter will be distinctively tart or sour due to the prevalence of the bacterial activity over the yeast. Young, mature and old starter all have their uses in baking, and it's the baker's job to learn when to use what for best effect. For more information, please watch Maintaining the Starter and Making the Leaven. This starter is quite runny, so we are going to use just 100 grams of it, feed it with 100 grams of water and 100 grams of our flour mix, and then use that to store in the fridge as our base starter. Now for 100 grams of the flour blend, and finally 100 grams of water. And mix. Nice lot of food here and lots of extra yeasts. So there we have it, one starter started. Don't forget your elastic band to help you measure the rise, and the lid with a hole to avoid explosions in the fridge. And that's it. If you're worried that at this stage your starter isn't strong enough or ready yet, bear in mind it can take another 2 to 3 days of feeding every 12 hours until you get the desired result. It all depends on what part of the world you're in, what kind of flour you've got, and what sort of water you're using. So if you're wondering what to do with this, the leftovers from making your perfect starter, the answer is don't worry, just eat it. Use it to make wonderful sourdough pancakes for your breakfast.